It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Doreen Ewert. Hope I got that pronounced right. I was interested in learning about how to teach vocabulary because in the teaching of Chinese, I often have a problem with that. And I've seen research that suggests there's a better way. So Doreen Ewert was strongly recommended by several people. She has a master's in English literature from Notre Dame, very long list of accomplishments, a number of publications in adult ESL learning, focus on pronunciation, reading, extensive reading and listening development and fluency. She's taught in Poland, Japan, Lithuania, and the US. She's taught English as a second language in those places. She has directed English programs for pre-academic and matriculated ESL learners, and her website says over several decades. She has taught undergraduate and graduate students in second language learning, English grammar composition. She currently holds a position in the University of San Francisco, directing the Academic English for Multilingual Students program, which seems to be a fairly large and vigorous program. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Ewert with all of her skills and abilities. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invitation to be here with you. It was a surprise when I got an email from Dr. Robertson, who I'd never heard of in my life, and I didn't know how he had heard of me. But I looked at this as an opportunity not only to share information, but to extend my experience in professional development by working in this kind of format. And so it has brought us to this day. Please be sure to send your questions, and I will try to pay attention, or someone will remind me when there is something I should be responding to. I do have a tendency to just get going. But it is, even in this format, meant to be, a workshop. So we'll try to get you doing things as soon as possible. And although there's some information fronted with more tasks and reflections further along, we'll try to get there. And then I'm happy to come back and fill in gaps or discuss other things along the way. All right, let's get to the next one. So because we too are learners now here in this moment, I do have some outcomes for us, and I'm really hopeful this will be beneficial. I don't know, of course, the range of experiences and training that you all have, and it would be great. I don't know how much time we have to really fill in on that, but I know right here with me here are foreign language instructors. So if just by a raising of hands, how many of you teach foreign languages? Okay, so most of you are doing that, which is great. I normally am working with people who are teaching English as a second language, but in fact, my research is about adults learning language as an additional language. And although we know the contexts are different, that doesn't entirely change the processes of what goes on in the mind. Or what the issues are for adults in learning context. So hopefully this will be of value for all of us. Okay, so although we will keep in mind and continually return to the issue of vocabulary, I thought it might be useful because, again, we know the textbooks, we've seen things, we've all tried methods, we've all used methods to learn vocabulary, that I might take a slightly different approach, and that might elicit some new ideas or create some curiosity in some new direction. So I'm starting with the concept of fluency. Now, by fluency, and I actually didn't put in anything that gives a definition of it, what I do not mean is the way in which we often use the term to refer to the outcome at the other end of all of our classroom learning activity. Like, I'm really fluent in Polish, which I couldn't say because I'm not really fluent in Polish, except from a linguistic point of view, what I do have in Polish, if I have anything, it is fluency. What I don't have is accuracy or complexity. And the fluency is, in fact, one component of of the construct of proficiency. And that's, what we're looking at here on this slide. And in fact, more recently, Skian has suggested that rather than the traditional complexity, accuracy, fluency construct, lexis or vocabulary should actually be added as a fourth because it is integrally involved in the accomplishment of any of the other three. So we're going to kind of move back and forth between the notion of how do we promote fluency as that one component of language proficiency, which means being able to use the language with relative comfort, ease, smoothness, disfluency we think of as, in oral production, too many pauses, not in the right places, trouble with, intonational things. But whatever it is that allows us to do things automatically, without a great deal of mental energy spent on attending to and thinking about, that makes it easy to have communication with anybody else. And that covers goes across all the skills. That doesn't mean just in terms of oral communication. Now, I did not start out trying to learn about fluency. What I was doing was trying to learn, figure out ways to better help pre-academic adult learners become more proficient at advanced tasks, ready for university work here. And as I delved into this, and in terms of practice and theory and research, empirical research, it kind of led me to what's being said these days in terms of how do we reach high levels of grammaticalization, for example, or how do we get to the place where we can communicate orally well, or even high levels of literacy. And it's quite interesting that there is a growing body of psycholinguistic and cognitive evidence, and also, you might say, sociocultural, contextual evidence in the ways in which people learn together, that we would actually find ourselves well served if we attended to fluency as somewhat of a prerequisite on which one can build complexity and accuracy. So there are those who have simply felt we have to really shift the focus to fluency first. Others would still continue to say that these are all mutually beneficial to each other. And while we attend to fluency, we are actually promoting accuracy. I tend to find, however, and you may find this also in your experiences and certainly in the research, that long and diligent attention to accuracy does not yield fluency. And therein lies the problem of so many language classrooms where students have very explicit and sometimes quite accurate knowledge of a language system and tremendous hesitancy or even inability to use the language meaningfully, spontaneously in any kind of fluent way. And so that also was bringing me the question. I mean, we have students who come with 10 years of, language classroom experience, and they aren't doing very much with the language. And of course, many of us have had that experience in learning other languages as well. So through these decades, of teaching and choosing textbooks and reading research and doing research, what I've really noticed is that we don't really attend to fluency. We kind of assume that just happens if we do this other kind of explicit activity in the classroom, and yet it's not happening. Likewise, we kind of expect very often that vocabulary will just happen as we're engaged in other activity. And as I've been observing teachers for decades already in so many classrooms, it's really kind of a hit or miss thing whether you see an instructor who will in any intentional way work on vocabulary development. And if they do, it's pretty random the methods or the directions they will choose in how they're going to deal with the vocabulary. And then there's the question of which vocabulary, which often seems entirely mysterious and perhaps at best driven by the textbook that you're working with, but that doesn't mean that it was necessarily driven by a lot of research in corpus linguistics or something else that actually tells us what would be, the high benefit words to work on, what would be the less beneficial words to work on. Which ones should we explicitly work on? Which ones should we provide environments where the sufficient repetition or necessity will yield, you might say, implicit or incidental learning. So we're going to kind of, work in that sort of area today. Paul Nation, an expert in vocabulary learning and reading and fluency development, has been voicing, however, for decades already, an alternate view of fluency development or the role of fluency, and that is that it doesn't necessarily precede all the others. It's not the outcome of all the others, but it is an integral part in with complexity and accuracy. And out of that, what he has basically said is we need to develop courses where we have a balance, you might say, between activity that attends to 4 different things, and we're going to look at that in a moment. So here's what Bill Grabe, recently a reading specialist, but again, it relates to fluency, and reading is very closely tied with vocabulary acquisition, so we'll look at his. So as you take a look at that and read that quote there, he really talks about this necessity and mentions specific things we can do that are related to vocabulary and reading that promote fluency. And this article is a good one to look at. He does quite a review of research in L1 and L2 reading fluency, and this is just a summative quote. But the activities mentioned include both those that are require explicit training and lead to explicit knowledge in the short run, and those that require opportunities for implicit learning over the long run. And we're going to look at those 2 concepts, and so that interplays with this too in terms of, as teachers, we feel validated and students validate us if we are doing something actively in the class, which almost by definition means explicit instruction, and yet that is not the only way that the mind works. And so we may be missing opportunities, you might say, to access more of what the learner mind has available to it if we only focus on explicit activities in the classroom. So, yes. Oh, one person has raised a hand. Got it. Do I click on her? Jennifer? Jennifer, you have a question? I see that you're typing. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm not used to where the signs are going to come up for me to pay attention. Okay, well, while Jennifer is typing, okay. Yes, I noticed that you had not put your hand up. Thank you. So also an L2 teacher several minutes ago. Thanks. Thanks, Jennifer. So Bill Grabe overall, though, after pointing this out, he enjoins practitioners to design courses and programs that allow for both explicit and implicit learning to foster fluency and therefore enhance its role in complexity and accuracy development. So what Nation calls a balanced language course is one that has 4 strands. And that means we need to learn from comprehensible, meaning-focused input. And by meaning, I mean it has relevance and purpose for the people who are engaged in the language activity. Useful language-focused activity. So whereas in ESL, at least, back in the 70s and 80s, with the heavy emphasis on comprehension and universal grammar, it was like, well, we don't really have to talk about the system at all. We'll just make it comprehensible and they'll just get it. Well, while there is quite a bit of truth in that, there is more research now that tells us particularly at high levels or more advanced levels of acquisition, you do need form-focused instruction, or you will not get to high levels of grammaticality. But it's quite interesting to note that even Rod Ellis, this is his area of form-focused instruction, he will tell you that we have overemphasized attention to form at the beginning level. And so he has actually really promoted that the attention to form should be quite incidental to or embedded within the meaning-making activity until you develop a certain, even an intermediate proficiency in the language, when the learner has enough resources to be able to say, you know, I really don't understand this. Can you explain this to me? And it can be done then, you know, purposefully and meaningfully in the second language, whereas rather than the sort of separate body of knowledge that is disengaged from actual use. So we can see the first one is meaning focused, the second is language focused, the third again is meaning focused, so input and output, and the fourth one is fluency development. And that is, you know, perhaps unique to many of us. Like, oh yeah, we kind of get what we do in those other areas, maybe too much of one, not enough of the other, but what do we do in fluency development? So of course this should happen across the skills, and I say that not to suggest in any way that we disaggregate the skills and teach them separately, but when we consider our entire curriculum, you know, how do I promote fluency in speaking as opposed to accuracy? You know, accuracy meaning you must pronounce it exactly correctly, and oh, that's the wrong way to say that, please say it this way, which is accuracy oriented, as opposed to, you know, talk to your neighbor as fast as you can, you know, in 3 minutes, and then, you know, see if you just be sure you understand each other, that kind of thing, which is just fluency oriented. How much do we do that across the skills? And so for today, we're going to focus really just thinking about these four components right now in terms of our teaching of reading and vocabulary. And again, I bring those together because they are so often, you know, where we feel the gap immediately as learners. I can't read because I don't have enough words. And in fact, it is our greatest source of input beyond the beginning level or just basic interpersonal communication. It's the main source in which we get our vocabulary. So what brings us to our first reflection. And you have a handout where you are. And so I would like the facilitators, if they can, to just, you know, again, you want to spend a moment alone in silence thinking about it and then discuss it, but report back reflection one, and that is, so for you, in your teaching, in your curriculum, in your program, just in regards to reading and vocabulary, how do your teaching practices match up in terms of these four components? You know, in balance, what do you emphasize, you know, what do you do, or like, wow, I don't think I'm doing anything like that. So just go ahead, we'll give you a few minutes and see how people, you know, tell me that they're ready to get back in the conversation here, okay?
See what they have to say.
How's it going out there? Okay, want to share some thoughts? Should I call on one group or? Okay.
We'll start here at Southwestern. We were talking about teaching elementary school children. My colleague here, who just banged her chair, is works in elementary schools, and we were trying to see how that applies, and we came to an idea of how the four things fit together in terms of reading. You know, it's really challenging in Chinese because at the beginning level they can read so very little, and it really restricts the pacing, or I mean pacing the vocabulary with the reading is a constant challenge. But you know, to me, I've come up with the idea that encouraging extensive reading is a very good idea, and then bringing the meaning aspect into it is very helpful too. To, you know, one thing I've done with my students is to just pass out a sheet of paper and say, tell me how you're feeling today, right? Write 5 lines on this sheet,
Right.
and then turn it in at the end of class. And no requirement, no, it's just totally free writing. And then I write back to them, which is a trick I got out of Alice Omaggio, you know, years ago, the context. But I think that kind of thing I could do a lot more with, and to think of doing it in even more beginning levels is a, you know, that's kind of what we're talking about.
And very beginning, I mean, ultimately, if you have no words, you simply have to learn some words. I mean, you know, you can't engage in a great deal of extensive reading either at that level. But working on the fluency, like through writing or orally, without focusing as much attention on how the system works as to actually trying to put whatever you have.
Right.
I mean, we talk about the acquisitional track. It starts in the pragmatic stage. And just think of the first time you were in a foreign country and you only had, you know, your little word book. I mean, that's the pragmatic stage. You know, you say one word and you gesture. But it is the beginning of making meaning. And then you get more lexical items, but you still use the pragmatics. You know, you're still, you know, people are filling in for you. And eventually you start getting some grammar. But it's not that we start with the grammar and then get the use. It actually starts with making meaning with individual words and signs, you know, body language, more words that are not accurate, and then increasing degrees of grammaticality and lexicon as it grows. And so what we find in form-focused instruction research is that we have truncated that in our classroom teaching. We don't give enough attention to that, you know, those first 2 stages, and we jump right into let's talk grammar. So I'm not saying don't, and they're not saying don't talk grammar or do things explicitly, but what are we doing to, just like you say, with writing, you know, or now try to vocalize, you know, with the 10 words you've got, put something together to communicate how you feel today. That's fluency building. Someone else there?
Since we're working with elementary school students, first and second graders, even, it gives us the opportunity to use something that you might not use with adults, but picture books, you know, great big picture books. And a lot of our teachers are hesitant to use very many books in the early stages because they feel like, well, they're not going to understand anything, you know, and we have not been using that many books. Yeah. And I'm thinking we need to use more books, especially those with pictures, because then they can hear, you know, the flow of the language, and they can figure things out while you're reading and pointing to words, you know, just like we do in English classrooms. But I don't know what you would do.
Well, surprisingly, I mean, you can do many of the same things, but you've tried to get content that is more relevant for the adults. So, for example, there are sometimes excellent picture dictionaries which can be used to, you know, talk about situations. And again, the first step in learning vocabulary, there are three main processes, and we'll come to those in a moment. The first one is you have to notice it. So in fact, when you've got a picture and someone says it, that's your first meeting. And that's a very efficient way to have your first contact. A quick translation is a fast contact or connection also, except if we did that, we'd never stop translating, and we don't know which words they know and don't know. So in fact, the more visuals we provide, the faster those connections start getting made. Other comments from Furman or Richmond?
Bedford County.
Okay,
Yeah. Can you hear
yeah.
Furman?
Go ahead.
We were just talking about some of the relevance of the vocabulary that we use in the beginning and intermediate levels, where sometimes the vocabulary is quite relevant to them, but sometimes it's not, and we might reflect afterwards and think, well, that might not be the most useful word or expression for them. And some of us also you pick which words out of the long list of vocabulary in the textbook that we will select for our students. And we also recognize that sometimes, depending on the textbook, the quality of the textbook can also have an impact on the vocabulary and vocabulary acquisition and whether or not it resonates with our students.
Yeah, absolutely.
But a lot of us did feel that we do focus on a lot of the elements that Nation suggested that are essential, but but it does depending on the textbook and level.
Well, that was the comment that came up immediately here, that we can see activity in those four areas through the entire curriculum, but what Nation and Grabe are calling for is equal attention to all four of those at every level in every course. And I think someone else can refer to what we sort of came up with here in terms of lower level courses and higher level courses. The lower level often get a lot of language focus, and the research would suggest that that's backwards. A modest amount, maybe a quarter of the time on language, but the rest on meaning making and fluency development. So it's not about whether we see these different emphases across, many years. It's every course at every level. We have a comment from Bedford Public Schools. They're having a lot of discussion about raising the bar, encouraging communication over accuracy in both oral and written work. I think this is really critical. Accuracy is the goal. Accuracy in everything, pragmatics, semantics, pronunciation, which adults rarely get and rarely need, but ultimately it's all about making meaning. It's using language for real purposes. And so we have often put, I think, the cart before the horse, expecting accuracy before real meaningful use. And many, Lightbound and Spada, also second language acquisition researchers, have a very lovely, understandable book on language acquisition and make it very clear. Accuracy is where we're going. It's not where we start. And when we ask students to be accurate at the start, we're not actually promoting their sort of building of an implicit use system that will be accurate in the end. I mean, hey, in my university, every professor wants the students, once they're out of that ESL class, they're not going to have any more problems. And I'm saying, no, we should all be working together so that when they graduate from university, they are highly communicative and mostly accurate in English, because they probably will never get all those articles in the right place. I mean, that's just, rare. And so to sort of harp on those things early on is really a lot of wasted time. They are very late acquired, and the best textbook descriptions are nothing on the complexity of the actual system.
There's a comment from Jennifer Shotwell as well.
Right, and so a comment from Southwestern, community engagement and service learning work very well for meaning-focused learning, but challenging to manage, no doubt, and also difficult with beginners, right? So when we have beginners, you know, we don't want to basically make it burdensome for somebody else, you know, to help our students learn in a service setting. But anything that can get them into a community and doing those things is certainly excellent. But I want us to really think about what do we do in our classrooms, you know. Okay, University of Richmond is typing something. Oh, from Jennifer. Yeah, Jennifer's comment. Furman's comment on relevance of vocabulary. Okay, wait a minute. I got to get back up there. Can I get back up there?
Mm-hmm.
So in assessment, she says they'll be asked to use or define 7 out of 10 words, for example, with the hope that they'll find at least 7 that are meaningful and memorable. Yeah, certainly making student choices. What's interesting for me is that, you know, how did those words get chosen? Like what rationale led the textbook designers, or even when we say, I think my students need these, you know, what are the rationale that cause us, you know, to make those decisions? And you know, that's something that we'll get to a little bit here, but that's really but giving them choice certainly helps it to be more relevant for them, for sure. Oh, and well, just so everybody else knows, someone at the University of Richmond says that apparently there is a good French textbook that does emphasize fluency. So that you might all want to get in touch and figure that one out. ESL books are being produced, you know, night and day, and often are pretty on top of things in terms of current research, and yet it is still very difficult to find things that are totally fluency based. Mm-hmm. Oh, the name of the textbook is Liaison. Okay, for first semester. Decent themes and contextualized vocab, you know, both really good. Well, I think we better move on or we won't get to other things. So stepping back just for a minute, my arrows have taken a move on the screen. Sorry about that. So when we talk about the big question, you know, always, well, why is second language learning so different than first? After all, first language learning is almost entirely an implicit phenomenon. In any language, children know, of course, not all the lexicon, but they know their structures, they know their syntax by about the age of 3 or 4. Most kids start school with a vocabulary. If they come from a home that is literate, they'll know up to 5,000 words when they start kindergarten. Of course, those will be the most frequent words in the language. Second language learners, however, aren't able, unless they get into you know, real good immersive experiences, and adults can do it too. It's typically a combination of implicit and explicit learning for L2 acquisition. But of course, the big question is, why is it that the success is so differential in adult learners? And that is the big question of second language acquisition research. So there's been a lot of discussion, and unfortunately, we saw earlier, my graphic has disappeared from this slide. I had a graphic for this slide that is important, and it was there earlier, and it has disappeared.
Can you go back and go back into it?
See, that one got changed, and there's no graphic here. I'm not...
Click again just to see if it'll fly in.
No. Okay. No, I didn't have this on animation. Okay, well, the interface question, we'll just have to talk about it. I had a graphic that basically shows this huge box for implicit learning leading to a smaller box for explicit learning that ends up in the learner's spontaneous proficiency. Because ultimately, that's really what we want and what the students want. They want a proficiency that they can use spontaneously for real purposes. So how do we get there? And there have been different models, and from the 70s, we were heavily influenced by this notion that the implicit learning and the explicit knowledge or learning were completely separate. So that was the Krashen model, basically, of language acquisition, that you got all this comprehensible input, that would build this implicit system, and anything you did explicitly ended up in your monitor, which was available to you if you had time and attention capacity to sort of use that information to modify what was in your implicit system. Well, no one holds to that anymore, but it's been a real discussion. Well, how does explicit classroom learned information relate to that implicit system, which is what we're all after, that spontaneous, immediate use of language? And it does turn out that now that we have more information about brain functioning from imaging, it's not a strong interface, but there is an interface between the two. So there are things that we learn in one way or another that do get stored in different places in our brain, but they are not completely separate. So things that we learn explicitly can become implicit knowledge over time. And it's exactly the fluency activity that seems to help that to happen, because fluency allows for, you might say, a lot of repetition. And repetition, and sometimes a little stress of time constraint, and repetition actually creates more of those neural pathways connecting with each other that puts it into deeper memory, which then becomes part of that implicit system. So this idea of there is a role for explicit activity, but what moves that explicit knowledge into that implicit deep knowledge, we have to think about how to strengthen the interface between those two. Too often they remain as like two separate capacities, and that's when particularly we focus only on accuracy. And Nick Ellis himself, who is a major researcher, psycholinguist, working on, from whom I got that graphic that you can't see, says very strongly, and is precisely because this interface between explicit and implicit is so complex that he also very recently confirms that Nation's model of always emphasizing those four components at every level in every class is important for making sure that we make the connections between implicit and explicit. But of course we use those terms, in complex ways. So I just wanted to put this up here. We have different ways. We have implicit and explicit memory, and that is in terms of the degree of priming needed to access. And you notice always the explicit always needs more. The implicit needs less. So implicit and explicit knowledge, degree of awareness needed. When it's implicit knowledge, you're not even aware of it. Implicit and explicit learning. Well, when you're explicitly learning, you're very conscious. You have to have intention. You're aware of what's going on. When it's implicit learning, you don't notice that you're learning. And we all know in our first languages, by the age of 5, we really were not aware at all of learning the language. Now, some people say, well, I remember my mom corrected me. Well, that was honestly after if you remember it, it was actually after you already had acquired, pretty much the full system. Of course, we continue to learn pragmatics through the entirety of our lives, and vocabulary there. Of course, we're always still learning things. And then implicit and explicit instruction, and that's sort of then, okay, what are we doing to facilitate the learning which leads to knowledge and memory? So you can look at that sort of from the bottom up. Our activity happens down here at the bottom, but the goal is really always to get to that implicit side of learning, knowledge, and memory. And this is Nick Ellis then, where I'll just let you read that. So again, brings us back to we have to have those four components. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to jump ahead to reflection 3. We're going to go back now and talk about vocabulary. Okay, so in reflection 3, let's just talk about what does it mean to know a word? What's your definition of knowing a word? And how do you measure this? And how many and which words do you need to know? So in your classrooms, how do you decide this? What are your expectations? See how that is similar or different? Or is it entirely, under the control of the textbook? I'll give you a few minutes to discuss that in your groups. Okay. Let me start with just share a couple comments here that folks have written in. Go down a little bit. So from Bedford Public Schools, a teacher here mentioned that she has students pick new vocabulary words from a list that another student may not know to form their list of new vocabulary to add to their personal dictionaries. And, you know, it all depends on, like, what are you going to, I mean, there's nothing right or wrong about it. If people are interested in the, you know, in the words, that's good. But I still, does the student know that those words will even come up again in the near future? So there are some criteria, you know, when we think about choosing words in terms of what will move from explicit to implicit, even though that's a, you know, that is a relevant thing. We have students explaining and summarizing in the target language early on. So, of course, as soon as they can do that, that's very good productive use of whatever vocabulary they have. Jennifer says, knowing often means, quote, being able to define in the L2 using circumlocution. For elementary level students, often imagine knowing means being able to select from a list of possible definitions, which of course we come to know because we've all been tested that way, but hardly an option for real life. You know, that someone will provide a list for us when we need them. From Furman, knowing a word means to use it in an appropriate communicative and cultural context. We moved on here. Did I go too far? I guess I did, didn't I?
No, you had it.
Did I have it? Cultural context. Oh yeah, we mentioned that we use assessments to test whether or not they understand the words from fill in the blank. We are more forgiving in the classroom with errors, but on assessments not as much. Yeah, I think that came up in our group too, that, you know, we might try to do things that encourage a receptive, an awareness of meaning rather than a productive meaning all the time, and yet when it comes to assessment, it pretty much ends up being, you know, do you have an accurate, productive use of the word? From Richmond, the ideal of, quote, knowing a word is being able to use it in appropriate context, but a first step is being able to recognize it. Knowing antonyms and synonyms. In other words, you have to relate the word to other words and concepts. For sure. All of these are important factors in knowing a word, which of course makes the whole process seem daunting because you could spend all day on one word, and nobody has time for that, and even if we did, that would never add up to the words we need. So clearly we need to think about some ways that are more, you know, time effective, you know, efficient, that really give students access to a lot of vocabulary that doesn't require that kind of constant explicit attention, which brings us again back to things we can do in fluency that will promote deepening connections with vocabulary. So this is what Nation says when we have lots of things when it means to know a word. And the next question is, you know, how many words and, you know, and which ones do you need to know? And there are different ways in which these have been understood and textbooks have been based on. But what's quite interesting, and again, I don't know the corpus linguistic research that's been done in all the foreign languages, but which has been done on English clearly shows that about 80% of all text, oral, written, all text, is from the first 2,000 to 3,000 most frequent words in the language. And when you take it down to a level like that, now you start to think, well, maybe we should be emphasizing those words. And so this is kind of an older model. If high-frequency words make up 80%, academic words make up another 9%, technical words 5%, that leaves very few low-frequency words. And the prior suggestions were we shouldn't spend any time in class working on low-frequency words because they will be learned incidentally only on the basis of already having a lot of the high-frequency words. Now, the problem with this is that if you taught all 3,000 words and whatever it is in your respective languages, that's only 80% of a text. And current research suggests that to read fluently, not for learning, reading at a comfortable rate for pleasure or information where you understand 75% of what's going on, could talk about it. You need 98% coverage. You need to actually have automatic word recognition for 98% of the words to read easily. So a newer view is not to think of it as these different types of vocabulary so much as we've got high frequency, mid frequency, and low frequency words. And they've raised the high frequency to about 3,000. And the technical and academic words actually are not layered on top of the high, mid or the high frequency words. They actually fill throughout. So there are some academic vocabulary words and technical words that are highly frequent. And so what we find often in foreign language instruction, that students might get kind of an odd set of a smattering of words that creates kind of like a narrow tower of vocabulary rather than what a native speaker has, which is a huge base of the most frequent vocabulary onto which they start to, build the less and less frequent words. And that makes it very difficult then for language learners to be able to do any reading because they have this kind of weird, some frequent, some less frequent, some mid-frequent, but they haven't built it up in sort of this solid base of high-frequency vocabulary. Yeah, so text coverage is about like that. And then learning. So Nation, Grabe, other researchers, Mira, suggests that Schmidt and Schmidt, that the high-frequency words are the ones that we should focus on intentionally. Well, let's say there are 2,000 or 3,000 high-frequency words. Well, what does it mean to focus on them intentionally? When we think about a curriculum that should be balanced between meaning, input, meaningful output, some language focus, and fluency. So we really have to not think about this kind of vocabulary as explicit instruction. How much of this high-frequency vocabulary can we get in ways that actually don't take up much class time, that actually use the resources of the learning mind and don't require us to attend to in the ways that we do with some small set of random words coming out of a textbook. So I have added, Nation and Schmidt have not added, but in fact, by extension, that they all highly recommend, for example, what Carl was mentioning earlier, extensive reading. There are ways to work at that solid, high-frequency vocabulary, both intentionally and incidentally. In other words, there can be explicit instruction for some, and a lot of implicit opportunities. And I call it instruction because only the teacher can make those opportunities available and train the students in how to avail themselves of it. So it's part of your job, or my job as a teacher, to create these explicit and implicit instructional contexts so that they can be getting as much as possible, as quickly as possible, to build up that solid base, on which then we can build more and more of the less frequent vocabulary, particularly as you move into advanced classes and content areas that will have their special vocabulary. So there are three things you have to get a word. You have to notice it, you have to retrieve it after noticing it, and you can't wait too long, and then you have to have creative generation. So basically, in my previous reflection, everybody mentioned that at some point, all of these, right? We first have to just know that it exists. And so there are tests that can simply say, have you seen this word before? Well, step one, okay. Then, do you have any idea what it might mean? Okay, step two, and then, of course, the highest level, can you use it creatively? Now, I'm not sure how clear that is to see, but there are some suggestions there of ways in which we can help students to notice. And one of them, of course, is by just having it highlighted, underlined, glossary, give a definition, all kinds of ways, give a first language definition, second language definition, all kinds of ways to help students to notice. Obviously, that's not enough. Then for retrieval, we have to strengthen the memory by having the students come upon the word again in maybe a slightly different context so that they have to go into their memory to retrieve it. And there are different theories on how long you can go between retrievals before it becomes a new event, like a new word. And the suggestion is typically that it's, you know, more than a month, it's like meeting it for the first time. So and 2 to 3 weeks is the, sort of the maximum that you should go between meeting a word. Otherwise, it's just gone, which is why we see in the research on deliberate, you know, instruction of vocabulary, it has great immediate outcomes. It does not do well in the long run. So while implicit learning takes much longer to add up, once you have it, it is sustained for a very long time. So it's not that we shouldn't do the deliberate, because our students need to learn things fast, but we should not neglect what they need to do to build up that long, strong, stable, that will actually last them long beyond our classes. And then, of course, there are lots of ways to do creative generation. And I think here is where, you know, our textbooks have all kinds of things to do. But what we might not be utilizing enough is the multiple ways of noticing, and particularly the multiple chances for retrieval in different contexts before or with productive use. Okay, so how is vocabulary being taught? And we're going to go faster because I think we kind of covered this already in an earlier conversation when you thought about what do you do for meaning, input, what do you do for output, what do you do for form, what do you do for fluency. Let's just focus on that fourth one, fluency. So when you're teaching vocabulary or you think you're doing something that is promoting noticing, retrieval, or creative generation, what fluency activity are you doing that would really be motivating those three processes? Let's just take a minute to think about that. Okay, we have a few comments coming in. For example, some folks do breaking down of words to show prefixes and word families, derivational forms and cognates. Try to get students to make connections with words. Absolutely. Different inflectional forms, things like that. Someone else want to vocalize rather than type?
This is Richmond. I know. This is Richmond, and we were talking a lot about oral language and oral comprehension and repeated extensive listening.
Repeated exposure, I think it might be that thing.
Thank you. I kind of get better down this. Just use some time. We're still on
Okay, sorry about that, Richmond. The sound is really, really hard from your site. Someone else was talking about using mnemonics along with meaningful input, for sure, extensive listening. One of the issues is how many times you meet the word. So noticing is good, and we need to notice things multiple times. If we notice them too far apart, it's like a new word. If we don't retrieve words soon enough, our next meeting will be like a new word. So many people say that we need to, meet a word in real contexts about 10 times until you might say, have a very strong receptive understanding of what the word means. And this can be even without, doing any kind of writing a definition or any kind of sort of really serious explicit work, just through incidental exposure. But notice, you have to notice, something has to draw your attention to it. It might be your own motivation. It could be that it was highlighted in the textbook. It could be the word that had a gloss, and so you noticed it. And then you have to have sufficient number of retrievals before you can get to, you might say, receptive, implicit knowledge of that word. And, there's nothing that anybody has said that aren't helpful for learning vocabulary, either to enhance noticing or retrieval or generative use. The problem is, it's still just a handful of words. That's the problem. It's such a handful of words. How can we build more quickly? So what I'm going to focus on now is just some fluency activities. I've listed here, and you can go back and look at them, and I can give you references. There are lots of things to do that are meaning focused and meaning for input and output, also form focused. I am going to mention, because many of you have mentioned, for example, word lists, vocabulary journals, word parts, keywords, mnemonic devices. It's quite interesting that in Nation's review of the literature, some of those are considerably less effective than others. In fact, the most convincing evidence for any of these, for like expanding the number of words and being effective, is actually word cards. The old-fashioned, word on one side, definition on the other side. And in fact, the research shows that even though we might not think that it's best if the definition is actually in the native language of the speaker, not the target language. So target language on one side, native language on the other side. Now, on the other side, with the native language, one can have full information. We don't want to like a two-language, like a bilingual dictionary kind of, one-to-one correspondence, because we don't want anybody to think that words, all have a single correspondence. So you want to make it a rich definition in your own language. You might give inflectional information, derivational information. You might talk about collocations, antonyms, a rich sort of description of the word. But the research shows that those are about the best. And then there's some very specific guidelines for how to set that up. And I put that in your handout. So if you look at task 1, oh, no, it's actually here. It's on the PowerPoint. So what goes on the card? Well, it's those high-frequency words that you should put on the cards, and those that are specifically needed to fulfill a language need, immediate to the learners. Word on one side, definition in the other one. Include pictures, diagrams. How many cards to work with? Well, it depends on the difficulty. So nouns are easier than non-nouns. So depending on the difficulty, determines the number of cards that you would work with at one time. If they're very easy words, they have done studies with students working with sets of cards up to 300, but divided into, 20 at a time. And then the goal is that there's a very structured way in which one needs to use the cards. And those notes here are on the PowerPoint. So you can read those later, but I just thought I'd point it out that even though I've used, I've used the list, I've used the journals, I've used all these other things, it was interesting to me that the research suggests that word cards are highly effective. They can be personalized to the student, also, required by the teacher, and they tend to show if the students are taught how to systematically review the words. Also, Nick Ellis shows that there is a kind of level, even though second language learners do not have to have phonology to learn to read in a second language, that in fact being able to say the word aloud to yourself, not silently, but aloud, adds to deeper processing. And there is some value to putting words in sentences and phrase contexts, but having a sentence example is actually not by itself more beneficial than just having a word with some other information about that word. Yes.
Given all the studies of late about students and human beings remembering better when they actually physically write something out, does that link at all to the way you're talking about these?
Absolutely. These should not be the purchased, general cards, because again, who's choosing those words? I don't know that they're the words that should be chosen. So, again, I would try to find out what are the most common words, the most highly frequent words in the language that make up most texts, and where the textbook corresponds with that, great. Where it doesn't, those textbook words that are really necessary can be added to the list. But I think that, and then the students get to choose their own in addition, the words they want to know, for whatever reason. And, but they need to be taught. And so there is this point of you write it down, after all, writing the word, spelling the word is part of knowing the words well in a literate society. Any other comments or questions? We're going to move on just to fluency things here. Yeah, so, someone was mentioning here an Anki flashcard program useful. Honestly, low-tech seems to be the most effective, partly because you do the writing part of it, you choose what goes on the card, and you can take small sets of them absolutely everywhere you go, and that's part of it, that there has to be this structured review. There takes a certain amount of time, you leave them in, then you take them out, then you bring them back. And I can lead you to, descriptions of these processes, but I wouldn't even actually recommend, a mobile option.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing with Anki is that it automatically shuffles the deck. Yeah. And recalls that kind of thing for you. But well, yeah. I'm all for low-tech. So just tell me this, for Anki, are they also writing in the words and choosing what the definition is? They are making the cards? No, you choose there are decks available, but there's a thing on there that says don't
Right.
make your own, don't use pre.
Right. Make your own, right.
Pre-
Well, if they, I mean, part of it
make
is
your
their ability to write that definition, you know, because that's where their interlanguage is at that moment. And if they get new information that requires them to change that, that's a deeper processing again of the use of the word. Yeah, I was kind of
That's good
delighted,
to
you
know.
know, because, well, I
That's
used
good to
those,
know.
you know,
Thanks.
50 years ago, and most of my students do not use them. And so I was quite happy to read the research on them. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to do some fluency activities, mostly in the relationship to reading, but it's because of its benefit in the implicit learning of vocabulary. And I realize we're almost out of time. That was a problem on my part. But here are these types of activities. And some of them are quite self-explanatory. And between the PowerPoint and the handout, you'll see exactly what needs to be done. It's always nice if we can actually experience them together. But probably what I would talk about is ones that you might not recognize. So the first one, how many of you have heard of 432? Anybody? No hands going up for 432? 432 is, I can't remember now, it came from a very long time ago, but Paul Nation sort of revived it. And it's great for oral work, but it is a way in which you basically do several things that are required to motivate fluency. One is time pressure. The other is repetition, right? And the other is zero expectation for accuracy. And you have to always have things that are easy enough, that aren't so complex that they have no resources. So 432 basically means that you put students in a row facing each other, give them a topic. So it could be the chapter, which uses the vocabulary. And you ask them a question, which will necessitate meaningful communication. And you give them time pressure. And then you simply move the students to a new interlocutor, and the same student has to say the same things, but with less time. So the 432 means 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes. I find with my beginning students, we pretty much start with 1 minute, 45 seconds, and 30 seconds, and that's about long enough. They just jabber away, and I just make sure it's happening in English. And that is a way that not only do they have noticing, because they're listening to each other, but they have multiple retrievals, both in listening and then they have to generate. They have to produce. And they have to do it several times. And so, again, you might come back to that topic in a week or in 2 weeks and see what more can be generated. Believe it or not, there are some very, seem like kind of old-fashioned activities. So if you look in your packet at task 3, rapid word recognition, this actually facilitates vocabulary learning and reading fluency development. Students typically in a second language read word by word. They're trying to translate word by word, and this actually does not contribute to comprehension or fluency because they don't have enough space in their short-term memory. So you simply, and there are ways that you can just make this yourself in your language. There are instructions here in the PowerPoint for how to do it. We'll let that one go. There's a way, it's very simply done, and you simply have your students, do this. So you can try it. You have 30 seconds to circle the identical word in the left column in the line beside. And I'm sorry, I'm getting old. I can't even do a whole page in 30 seconds anymore, but my, 20-year-olds can still do it. But if it's not your foreign language and you're not recognizing those words quickly, it's very slow. So these are actually mechanical vocabulary and fluency building activities. And typically we might do 5 pages like this once a week and then come back to it, again. And it can be the vocabulary that you're trying to emphasize or, again, just broader vocabulary from that most frequent list. Actually reading and rereading the very same passage. your comprehension goes up, your fluency goes up, your vocabulary knowledge goes up. And there are a variety of ways. This is very old. It's been recent studies in like 2008 by Chung and Nation have shown, Gorzuk and Taguchi, showing real effectiveness for second language adult learners improving their vocabulary and reading fluency by simply rereading. Speed reading. So these are things that we have to explicitly do in the classroom, but they're actually motivating implicit learning and requiring students to read at a certain speed, but also requiring them to, or reading at their own speed, but they should not get 100% accuracy. Then they're reading too slow. You know, things like this, ways to challenge them to read faster. Paced reading, and I've given you two methods there and examples of text so that you can see what they look like. So these are things that really are not typically done because they feel like they're skill building, they're not really about the language, and yet they can be done, you know, 5 minutes of a class. So the issue of covering the textbook can still be dealt with, and they're very short, and yet they actually contribute to the noticing, the retrieval, which is the foundation for generative use. But more important, we can really introduce way more vocabulary to the students to try to build up that high frequency base on which everything else is developing. And then probably the most important thing is extensive reading, and some of you know about it. That can be a whole nother workshop on extensive reading. But the important thing is that it has to be easy. And for absolute beginners, you really cannot do extensive reading. Extensive reading really can only start, you know, once you have enough vocabulary to read a simple text. And there is a lot of literature being written for adult beginner language learners. I don't think so much is being written in all the foreign languages. Spanish has a growing body of literature. I can give access to, you know, other sources online, but I have teachers who are also writing, you know, for their students, the kinds of things, and there's a whole, you know, way of going about writing this kind of material. So it's authentic. We're not talking about abridged, you know, text. We're talking about authentic text, interesting to adults at different levels. And the extensive reading that's available in English, which is thousands of books, is focused entirely on that first 3,000 most frequent words. And that probably is the most efficient way to motivate sort of the implicit learning, but the challenge, of course, is finding things that are easy enough. And there are some online sites, and I will leave you, I mean, you'll have access to all the resources that I have in terms of finding things. And then there are simple rules that students can follow, you know, for how to find something that's easy enough. Most of what we do in classes is right at where the students work intensively. And that's good. That's good for even maybe 75% of what we do in the class. But there needs to be that quarter of time that is really pushing fluency. And then it has to be easy. And it has to be easy. So the reason I brought reading into that is because it is such a source of vocabulary. So, and we need to increase the fluency, the implicit learning, and we already do many of the good explicit things in the classroom. So I know, I mean, I'm happy to talk longer, but I know people have to go, and I don't, you know, want to keep you. And I apologize that we didn't get to go through some of these, but they're I think, quite self-evident. Comments?
Thank you very much. We enjoyed it.
Excellent.
Go get those
This is
white
just
blank
what I
cards.
needed. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've used them for years and years, and I'm starting to use
Yeah.
PowerPoints, but
I often
I'll
buy
go
a
back
box
to
and
the
start my
chart.
students off, you know, by giving a set to each student to get them started, you know, and that's one way to do it. Yeah. Sure.
That's a good idea. Thank you.
Any additional comments or questions?
All time was up.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, well, I'm happy, but you know,
It's a lot to absorb.
okay, bye.
Thanks again.
What?
I'll be signing.
Well, you know, the thing is, language classrooms are typically flipped, you know, already. And so, yeah. Then you get into, you know, it's just, so that's what we normally do too, but, yeah, this was too much. Needed more flipping. But these are pretty self-explanatory.
And the PowerPoint this will be available, the PowerPoint.
Well, the PowerPoint which is up here, yes.
Yes, and then I will also send all the references and the resources. So there are some really excellent resources for doing any of these too, you know, that tell you how to
So-
do it.
Was the pre?
What I said was the pre-workshop, the activities for that.
Yeah.
So we need to get you registered officially. So you have access to the Kai site.
I didn't register because it didn't, I registered too.
I registered you.
I didn't get it.
Hmm.
I didn't get I registered online, but then we got any feedback, so I couldn't.
Yeah, me too. I registered online and didn't get feedback. I didn't.
Okay.